Good afternoon. I'm Erin Murray. I am a PhD candidate in Rhetoric and Composition at the University of Kansas. Due to circumstances beyond my control, I regret that I'm not able to give this presentation in person, but I'm very grateful to the English Graduate Organization at the University of Florida for entertaining my presentation digitally. Today I'll be presenting an investigation into the idea of the public sphere theory, specifically in terms of Michael Warner's public sphere theory from his book Publics and Counterpublics. Further, this is also an investigation into alternative rhetoric as discussed per David Wallace in his book Compelled to Write. I turn my attention to a practical application of both theories as applied to the Occupy Wall Street movement, specifically in looking at the circulation of memes that spread throughout the internet created by the members of the movement. I posit that Warner and Wallace's theories work together, not independently, to strengthen the theory of a public sphere as evidenced through the OWS movement in particular. In September 2011, a movement in the streets of New York City began influencing young people and blue-collar workers throughout the United States and has since taken to the streets and to the web to become a worldwide spectacle. The Occupy Wall Street movement has prompted the working class, college students, and anyone who feels affected by economic injustice throughout the country to organize peaceful demonstrations, resulting in sometimes hostile responses from public authorities. Video evidence of OWS activists being pepper-sprayed en masse and being beaten or violently restrained spread throughout the internet. Contemporary to the madness of the circulating videos, the Occupy Wall Street movement took to the web and promulgated a new kind of protest via multimodal rhetoric. One of the most iconic movements of this group of Occupy Wall Street protesters is the internet meme of the self-identifying 99% posting images of themselves with handwritten testimonials of their personal economic struggles, a window into a realistic image of the majority of America being harshly affected by the taxes that should be directed, as the group notes, towards the wealthiest populace of the nation, the 1%. In terms of rhetorical scholarship, we can look at these memes as evidence of the formation of a counterpublic movement. Public sphere theory has long been contested and re-theorized since Jürgen Habermas's introduction of the idealized 19th century European bourgeois public sphere, a forum where the enlightened could participate in rational critical debate regardless of each participant's economic status. Ideally, participants would bracket their differences at the door, creating equal ground for all to converse about public concern and common interests. The problem with this idealized public sphere theory, as numerous scholars have noted, is that we are unable to bracket all of our differences at that salon door. Habermas's bourgeois public sphere was comprised of middle-class men, and regardless of her economic status, a woman would be unable to participate because she cannot bracket her womanhood at the door, nor can a lower-class participant or wealthy man bracket his inherent class-specific language nuances either. In light of these contradictions, the bourgeois public sphere theory has been challenged by Nancy Fraser and others' proposal of a counter-public sphere theory, an alternative public sphere formed by those who are in opposition to the bourgeois public sphere in some radical way. Fraser suggests that contemporary to the bourgeois public sphere were also a host of competing counterpublics. These counterpublics contested the exclusionary norms of the bourgeois publics and forged for themselves alternative styles of political interaction and speech. To situate the OWS movement in specific terms, I turn to Michael Warner's theory of publics and counterpublics. Warner outlined 7 traits of a defined public. A public is self-organized, a public is a relation among strangers, the address of public speech is both personal and impersonal. A public is constituted through mere attention. A public is the social space created by the reflexive circulation of discourse. A public acts historically according to the temporality of its circulation. A public is poetic world-making. Counterpublics use these public-making strategies in opposition to the wider public. The main difference between publics and counterpublics is the latter maintains, as Warner notes, at some level, conscious or not, an awareness of its subordinate status. The cultural horizon against which it marks itself off is not just a general or wider public, but a dominant one. In his book Compelled to Write, David A. Wallace presents and expands upon the idea of alternative rhetoric and ways of reading and engaging in alternative rhetoric practices. Wallace urges writers to think critically, but in doing so to recognize that one's thoughts and actions are situated in one's influences and upbringing, which inherently limits one's ability to fully identify with someone else or someone else's troubles, or even to fully identify oneself. Wallace borrows the term intersectionality from queer theory to theorize about alternative rhetoric's ability to present and account for the social identity and position of the alternative rhetorician. Intersectionality is a critical recognition within queer theory which argues we must get beyond binary notions of identity so that we don't perpetuate limited identities within ourselves. Opacity is a term Wallace borrows from theorist Judith Butler, and it refers to the idea that complete self-knowledge or self-definition is not possible because we are all reliant on social norms beyond our control, not only for our understanding of ourselves and our position in the world, but also for the means to engage with that world in meaningful ways. In light of opacity and intersectionality, it might seem impossible to gauge in alternative rhetoric practices because of a full lack of understanding of not only ourselves but others. However, Wallace sees opacity as a way to embrace difference in ourselves and others, giving us a chance to create morally responsible rhetorical agency. Opacity and intersectionality complicate our identities, but the idea being, if we are willing to tap into our identities, we can more fully understand our participation in society and our relation to one another. In a similar vein, Warner's counterpublic theory is dependent upon members' identities. As Warner notes, counterpublic participants remain oriented to stranger circulation in a way that is not just strategic, but constitutive of membership and its effects. Because publics and counterpublics circulate discourse among a public of strangers, one's identity in the public circulates so the private becomes public and accessible and relatable to others in the same position, creating a deeper understanding among the populace. The identity of the counterpublic participant, then, is in line with the alternative rhetorician. Through a case study of the OWS movement, I'll illustrate how the 99% can be viewed as a prominent counterpublic sphere as defined by Michael Warner's public sphere theory, whose members in turn participate fully as proprietors of alternative rhetoric, per Wallace's coining, by way of creating internet memes to further spread the OWS message. I have used the website wearethe99%.org for analysis of memes created for the OWS movement. The site archives thousands of memes from across the United States uploaded by anyone who wishes to share his or her testimonial. The participants are, as the movement notes in its description, of all ethnicities and ages, speaking on behalf of themselves and their families. The testimonies vary in message length from a few words written largely in bold colors to life stories chronicled in fine print. For this study, I've chosen to analyze memes posted within the months of January to April 2012 to limit the results presented. This gave me roughly 80 samples from which to choose for analysis. Wallace claims 4 steps toward the practice of alternative rhetoric, which I will expand upon shortly, and I've chosen to discuss 4 memes that exemplified the 4 criteria in order to illustrate the alternative rhetoric making within the OWS counterpublic movement. To begin, I want to situate the OWS movement within Warner's definition of a public and counterpublic sphere. Warner's first 2 criteria of a public sphere are that a public is self-organized and a relation among strangers. A public comes into being because of a need for the public. What situates OWS as a counterpublic is the movement's coming into existence by virtue of being pitted against a dominant public, the United States government. The ability for text to self-organize a public is one of the fundamental properties of the 99% memes. The memes created and spread by the self-identifying 99% are made and spread so that others will see the messages and identify or sympathize or, in some way, be called to act and join the movement. Which addresses Warner's third criterion, that the address of public speech is both personal and impersonal. The OWS movement is propelled by a communal sharing of testimonies about personal economic hardship brought about by the U.S. government's chronic economic favoring of the elite and snubbing of the majority. These testimonies are seen, as Warner notes, in 2 ways, as being addressed to us and being addressed to strangers, which means our subjectivity is understood as having resonance with others. The OWS memes relate to a wide public of OWS activists, both personally and impersonally, because of the understood addressee, those interested in joining or learning more about the public movement of Occupy Wall Street, and those who find themselves in the testimonies of others. Warner's 4th criterion of a public sphere is that a public is constituted through mere attention. Warner continues, the existence of a public is contingent on its members' activity, however notional or compromised, and not on its members' categorical classification, objectively determined position to the social structure, or material existence. By virtue of the OWS movement having active participants, be they protesting on university campuses, organizing stand-ins on city corners, or uploading testimonials to a meme base, the movement can be called a public because its members acknowledge the existence of the movement by their engagement. Warner's 5th and 6th criteria for the formation of a public are: a public is the social space created by the reflexive circulation of discourse, and publics act historically according to the temporality of their circulation. By reflexive circulation, Warner means conversations within a public sphere enabled among members of the public by way of circulating texts. Memes circulating around the internet of OWS activists and their testimonies enable conversations via social media outlets like Facebook and Twitter, furthering conversation and furthering the message of OWS to a wider public. The members' willingness to circulate texts inside and outside the OWS counterpublic sphere widens the breadth of public reach and, in a sense, advertises for new membership. But in order to circulate reflexively, the text produced must be routinely and consistently created and circulated. As time progresses, if the creation and circulation of text within a public tapers to a crawl, action becomes harder to imagine. The Internet has had a lasting impact on public temporality. Meme bases like wearethe99%.org will stay publicly viewable until the domain owner fails to pay his or her monthly bill. As long as the site continues to pull in viewers, the public identity of the organization will continue to exist. This is one great advantage of the circulation of memes as evidence of public texts. If members of the OWS public continue to create and upload these memes, they will certainly find their way into the public eye of social media. As per Warner's final criterion of a public is poetic world-making, the memes of the 99% only strengthen the image of the OWS movement by giving a literal picture of the majority of America. This is how I interpret Warner's idea of poetic world-making. Publics and counterpublics create identities through their circulation of texts that strengthen and illustrate the ideals on which their individual publics are created. In this way, the OWS counterpublic sphere is founded on the principles of equality for all people who are affected by economic hardship due to unjust government economic policy, and, as such, define themselves in concordance with others who identify as being negatively affected by government policy. The activism of OWS is fully based within each member's intersectionality and opacity, realizing that each participant within OWS is tied to one another by way of shared hardship or belief that the U.S. economy is unjustly treating the majority of Americans. The OWS movement exemplifies its poetic world-making by means of alternative rhetoric as interpreted in the memes circulating around the Internet that not only situate members of the OWS movement as personally impacted by injustice, but also usher others to participate in a similar way, to share their stories publicly so as to create a massive movement through which change can happen. What you are seeing on the screen is a meme from wearethe99%.org. Here's the translation. I am a green card carrying Chinese person with a family of 4. Because my husband has worked so many years in a restaurant, he now has health issues because of his blood pressure. We are peaceful, law-abiding residents. Because of landlord harassment, who has threatened us with eviction, we are fighting gentrification. We need to protect the rights of tenants. Every year the rent increases. Sometimes the landlord doesn't turn on the heat or hot water. The landlord is trying to evict us, and we are currently in housing court. We have to work to save money for rent to pay the rent to survive. It's really tough on us. We are the 99%. From this meme, we learn of this woman's many identities. This woman sees herself in multiple roles and is able to relate to others through shared experience of economic hardship, but also as a member of a marginalized group of people experiencing troubles with landlords and discrimination. All of these factors, plus more than we could ever hope to know about this woman, color her view of life and influence the position that she takes within the Occupy Wall Street movement. To better understand theoretically what is meant by alternative rhetoric, David Wallace defines it in this way. I begin with the assumption that rhetoric becomes alternative when it engages the individual's subjectivity rather than attempting to erase it, and accounts for the positioning of that subjectivity within the discourse of power that enfranchise some and marginalize others. In this sense, I argue that the alternative rhetoric is a meaningful term only if it is grounded both theoretically and practically in a recognition that the effects of engaging in discourse are, to some extent, always beyond our capacity to understand and control, and yet, paradoxically, that we are also responsible for those effects. The memes circulating within the OWS counterpublic sphere exemplify alternative rhetoric in practice. The creators situate themselves within the public of not only OWS activism, but within American society, and present their identities as students, as blue-collar workers, as unemployed citizens, and so on in the big picture of being American and of being impacted by economic injustice. In some cases, they identify themselves by ethnicity, by sexual orientation, or by privilege to place their own experience at the forefront of the issue, to situate themselves within the public of the movement. Though they may not be aware of their full identities and, in turn, the full extent of the outside influences on their identities, they acknowledge their differences and acknowledge that their personal experiences color their call to action. Wallace claims 4 ways in which the pedagogy of alternative rhetoric can be practiced. The first is to write like a man. Wallace acknowledges the irony of this statement. To write like a man would be to deny one's identity or marginalization if one isn't indeed a man, and otherwise stereotypes the idea of how a man should write. What he means is that by creating a voice for the marginalized or oppressed, by writing in ways generally not associated with subordinate people, or by asserting oneself through writing as a dominant voice, one can begin to practice alternative rhetoric. This meme is written in strong language, evidenced by the capital letters, frequent underlining, and exclamation points. But this author is a young girl. She is writing outside of the genre that is assumed of her and writing with authority, like a man. Situating herself as a student, as economically impoverished, as strong-willed, as the child of immigrants, as empathetic to her parents' hard work and little benefit, she recognizes aspects of her opacity. She emphasizes her willpower to fight and her identity as the 99%. By recognizing her opacity and employing discourses of power, she is using those discourses of power against the interests of those in power. She is engaging in alternative rhetoric. The second of Wallace's 4 criteria is to tell your story. Wallace makes aware that narrating one's experience isn't a guarantee that the narrator has adequately explored his or her objectivity. In order for a story to have agency, the narrator has to bring aspects of systematic inequities in our society into focus, to create powerful voice from the otherwise oppressed. Juxtaposing inherent privilege with oppression is a trend in the OWS memes. Not that this is a popular method of discourse, but because the meme creators do not necessarily recognize inherent privilege. However, the memes do not present themselves as bragging. On the contrary, even seemingly privileged activists identify with the 99% and present themselves as almost apologetic for having ever experienced economic privilege. This meme presents a much different picture than the previous. This young girl seems to be airing a confession while also self-identifying with the majority of OWS activists. Though she is also very much unaware of the privilege that surrounds her, this meme creator is honest about the facts that she feels need to be made public about her economic identity and hardship, and, in being honest to her identity, is practicing alternative rhetoric. Wallace's 3rd criterion is to untame your tongue. In Untaming Our Tongues, Wallace is urging rhetoricians to stake claim and social change by resisting dominant cultural values and the discourse practices that support them. This is a difficult challenge. We have to recognize our position as a marginalized public and counter that position by adopting the voice of the dominant public. Much like writing like a man, untaming our tongue is a challenge to speak of our position and our privilege in opposition to oppression. Here is presented a good example of this criterion. This meme creator snaps his photo and testimonial in his computer's webcam. His handwriting is neat and decorative. The ink color challenges traditional norms of masculinity and seriousness. His message is short, straightforward. The lighting in his room is dim, but the writing on his testimony is in focus. He speaks his mind. He aligns his beliefs with those of others succinctly and asserts himself against the established societal norms. He relates to the majority and challenges authority. He's experimenting with alternative rhetoric. The final criterion is to not take yourself too seriously. In a movement like OWS, it's hard to find anyone who isn't taking the movement seriously. All OWS memes are serious in tone and message, but some of the ways in which people present their messages are humorous at first glance, alluding that perhaps there can be a playful spirit embedded in the activism. A young child in a bright teal coat and floral print t-shirt teases the camera with a snarky smile. She holds a sign written in block letters, each letter a different color, scribbled in marker. The message of the sign is clear, and though we don't know much about the girl in the image except that she's much too young to fully understand the OWS movement, the taunting comment on the sign makes us laugh and sigh a dejected sigh of agreement. In order to relieve some of the burden of oppression from outside the OWS movement, some members of the Counterpublic write sarcastic and ironic quips to contrast with the heartfelt, oft disheartening testimonials. They practice alternative rhetoric through wit and creativity. In light of examining the OWS movement as counterpublic per Warner's criteria, and in looking at the circulating text produced by the movement through the application of Wallace's alternative rhetoric theory, I propose an addendum to Warner's theory of publics. The formation of a public is reliant upon members' recognition of their intersectionality and opacity with each other. Recognizing common interests, identities, backgrounds, and so on enables a public to form. Yes, publics are self-organized, and yes, they are a relation among strangers, but it is exactly that relation that needs to be examined further. A public comes into being by recognizing that each member shares his or her intersectionality with the next member, not just a shared love of a television show or a social cause, but because each member has inherent influences on his or her life that have enabled that shared connection. In the case of OWS, the public formed because of an understanding that each member faced some kind of oppression based on social or economic status. The meme makers have engaged in a creation of alternative rhetoric that accounts for their positions within the webs of meaning that make communication possible. Each participant situates his or herself in terms of intersectionality. Their shared identities as students, mothers, husbands, sons, aunts, unemployed, injured, underrepresented, and more add to their identity formation and subjectivity. These shared identities create strong ties among the public formation. Wallace's alternative rhetoric practices of intersectionality and opacity are essential to the identity of publics and, as far as I am concerned, cannot be separated from the public sphere theory.